Did you really just introduce me as your wife who does crafts? I asked Marcus as we drove home from his company's annual gala, my hands still trembling with humiliation in my lap. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The November rain pelted against the windshield of his Mercedes as he glanced at me with that condescending smile I had been seeing more and more lately. Well, Sarah, what else would I call it? You make children's books. It's not exactly corporate finance. His words hung in the air between us like poison, and in that moment, I realized that my husband of 8 years had absolutely no idea who I actually was or what I had accomplished. What he didn't know, what he was about to discover in the most spectacular way possible, would change everything between us forever. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the life I had built before that humiliating evening, and show you exactly how a woman dismissed as someone who does little crafts became the one person Marcus's entire career would come to depend on. My name is Sarah Chen, and at 34 years old, I had spent the past decade building something I was genuinely proud of. I am an author and illustrator of children's books, specializing in stories that help young readers navigate complex emotions and difficult life transitions. My books have titles like When the Colors Feel Too Loud, for children with sensory processing challenges, The House with Two Doors for kids experiencing divorce, and Grandma's Garden Keeps Growing, for children grieving the loss of a grandparent. Each book takes me approximately 6 months to complete from initial concept to final illustration, and I pour everything I have into making sure that every word and every brushstroke serves the emotional needs of the children who will hold these books in their small hands. I work from our home in Portland, Oregon, in a converted sunroom that overlooks the Japanese maple tree Marcus and I planted when we first bought this house 7 years ago. The room is filled with natural light that changes throughout the day, illuminating my drafting table, my digital drawing tablet, my shelves of art supplies, and the wall where I pin character sketches and story outlines. This is where I spend my days, usually from 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, when I break to prepare dinner and transition into the evening hours with Marcus. My workspace reflects the nature of my work, with watercolor paintings in various stages of completion, sketches of children's faces expressing nuanced emotions, color studies exploring how different palettes can convey feelings of safety or anxiety or joy. There are also the business aspects of my work scattered across my desk. Contracts with my publisher, royalty statements, emails from my agent, correspondence with school librarians and child psychologists who consult on my projects, and marketing plans for upcoming releases. The work is both creative and commercial, artistic and strategic, deeply personal and thoroughly professional. When Marcus and I first met 9 years ago at a mutual friend's wedding in Seattle, I was just beginning my career as a children's book author. I had recently graduated with my Master of Fine Arts in Illustration from the Pacific Northwest College of Art, and had just sold my first book to a small independent publisher. Marcus was 3 years into his career as a financial analyst at Clearwater Capital Management, one of the most prestigious investment firms in the Pacific Northwest, and he was already making a name for himself as someone with exceptional instincts for identifying undervalued assets and growth opportunities. He was handsome in that carefully groomed way that successful young professionals cultivate, with dark hair always perfectly styled, designer suits that fit him exactly right, and the kind of confident smile that suggested he had never encountered a problem he could not solve with enough analysis and strategic thinking. I found him impressive and ambitious, and he seemed genuinely interested in my work. During our early dates, he would ask thoughtful questions about my illustration process and the research I did into child psychology and emotional development. He told me he admired my creativity and my dedication to helping children, and he said that my work mattered more than most people's because I was shaping young minds during their most formative years. We got married 14 months after that wedding where we met, in a beautiful ceremony at the Portland Japanese Garden, surrounded by friends and family. Marcus's parents flew in from Boston, traditional and reserved, clearly pleased that their son had chosen a spouse with graduate education and professional ambitions, even if those ambitions were in the arts rather than business or law. My parents came from Vancouver, bringing their warmth and enthusiasm and my father's camera equipment to document every moment. It felt like we were building something solid and lasting. A partnership between two people who respected each other's work and supported each other's dreams. The early years of our marriage were good. We bought our house in the Laurelhurst neighborhood, a charming 1920s bungalow with original hardwood floors and built-in bookshelves and enough space for both of us to have dedicated work areas. Marcus had his home office for the evenings when he brought work home from Clearwater, and I had my sunroom studio for my books. We fell into comfortable rhythms, with me working during the day on my manuscripts and illustrations while Marcus went to his downtown office, and then evenings together cooking dinner and talking about our respective projects. Marcus would tell me about the companies he was analyzing, the investment strategies he was developing, the office politics he was navigating as he worked his way up from analyst to senior analyst to associate. I would share my progress on whatever book I was developing, show him character sketches, read him draft passages and ask for his feedback on whether the emotional arc felt authentic. He seemed genuinely interested. Or at least I thought he did. He would look at my illustrations and say things like, "That's really nice, honey," or "You're so talented," in tones that I interpreted as supportive rather than what they actually were, dismissive. The first book I published after we got married was called The Worry Box, a story about a young girl who learns to manage her anxiety by writing down her fears and putting them in a special box she decorates herself, only taking them out at designated worry times rather than carrying them around constantly. The book was moderately successful for a children's book from a small publisher, selling around 15,000 copies in its first year, and receiving positive reviews from School Library Journal and Kirkus Reviews. I was proud of it, and Marcus took me out to dinner to celebrate when I received my first royalty check. But I started noticing small comments that suggested his view of my work was changing, or perhaps was finally being revealed. When I told him I had signed the contract for my second book, he said, "That's great, babe, every little bit helps with the mortgage." When I showed him the favorable review in Publishers Weekly, he glanced at it quickly and said nice before returning his attention to his phone and some urgent work email. When I mentioned that I had been invited to do a reading at a local elementary school, he said, "That's sweet, like show and tell for grown-ups," in a tone that made it clear he found the whole thing rather quaint and insignificant. I told myself I was being oversensitive. Marcus worked in a high-pressure environment where success was measured in millions of dollars and basis points and market share. Of course, he viewed my work through a different lens. His world was about quarterly earnings reports and stock valuations and competitive positioning. My world was about helping a 6-year-old feel less alone when her parents were fighting, or giving an 8-year-old language to express grief he did not have words for yet. These were different kinds of impact, different measures of value, and I should not expect him to understand my work the way another artist or educator might. But the comments continued and escalated. When I was working on my third book, The Day Everything Changed, about a young boy whose father loses his job and the family has to move to a smaller apartment, Marcus walked into my studio and watched me working on an illustration of the boy's face as he packed his belongings. "Still drawing sad kids?" he asked, not unkindly but with a tone that suggested he found my subject matter somewhat morbid or at least puzzling. "It's about resilience and adaptation," I explained, but he had already moved on, checking his phone for stock prices or sports scores or whatever was more interesting than my explanation. By our 5th anniversary, a pattern had clearly established itself. Marcus's career was ascending rapidly. He had been promoted to vice president at Clearwater Capital Management, managing a team of analysts and handling increasingly important client relationships. His income had grown substantially, and with it, his sense of his own importance and his subtle but unmistakable dismissal of work that did not operate at the same financial scale as his own. Meanwhile, my career was also growing, but in ways that were less visible to someone who measured success primarily through compensation and corporate hierarchy. My fourth book, When Words Feel Stuck, about a child with selective mutism who finds other ways to communicate, had won the Charlotte Zolotow Award, a significant honor in the world of children's literature that recognized excellence in picture book writing. I was thrilled and proud. Marcus congratulated me and took me out for a nice dinner, but when I tried to explain what the award meant in my field, how it was given by the Cooperative Children's Book Center, and was highly competitive and prestigious. He nodded politely in a way that made it clear he considered it a participation trophy rather than a genuine achievement. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm sure that's a big deal in the kids' book world, he said, cutting into his steak. It's just different from what I'm used to, you know? At Clearwater, we're competing with Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. The stakes are billions of dollars. But this is important too, in its own way. The qualification, that in its own way, told me everything I needed to know about how he had come to view my work. As a hobby that occasionally received recognition from other hobbyists, pleasant enough but fundamentally separate from the serious business of the real world. I should have said something then. I should have pushed back and insisted that he understand that my work was not a lesser version of real work, but was instead a different kind of work with its own standards of excellence and its own meaningful impact. But I did not. I smiled and thanked him for dinner, and told myself that our marriage did not require him to fully understand my professional life as long as he was generally supportive, which he was in his limited way. He never told me to stop writing. He never complained about my using the sunroom as a studio. He never objected to the time I spent on my books. He just did not take them seriously, and I had convinced myself that this was acceptable. The turning point, or at least the moment when his dismissiveness became impossible to ignore or rationalize, came about 3 months before that terrible corporate gala. I had just received news that my publisher was offering me a 3-book contract with a significant advance, the kind of financial commitment that indicated they saw me as a valuable part of their catalog and expected my future books to perform well commercially. The advance was substantial, more than Marcus made in 2 months at Clearwater, and I was excited to share the news with him. I planned a special dinner, cooking his favorite meal of pan-seared salmon with roasted vegetables and wild rice. I set the table with our good dishes, and opened a bottle of the Oregon Pinot Noir he particularly enjoyed. When he came home from work that evening, I was practically vibrating with excitement about sharing my good news. We sat down to dinner and I told him about the contract, about the advance, about what this meant for my career trajectory, and my financial contribution to our household. Marcus listened, nodding occasionally and taking bites of his salmon. When I finished explaining everything, he reached across the table and patted my hand in a gesture that was probably meant to be affectionate, but felt profoundly patronizing. That's really great, Sarah. I'm proud of you. It's nice that your little books are doing well. At least now your hobby is paying for itself instead of us having to subsidize your art supplies. He said it with a smile, as if he was being supportive and generous rather than devastating. My little books? I repeated, my excitement curdling into something cold and hard in my stomach. Marcus, this is a significant publishing contract. The advance alone is more than $60,000. This is not a hobby. This is my career. He took a sip of his wine and shrugged slightly. Sure, it's your career. I'm not saying it isn't. I just mean that it's not the same as a regular corporate job with benefits and retirement accounts and a clear advancement path. You're basically self-employed, making books for children. It's creative and that's wonderful, but let's not pretend it's the same as what I do at Clearwater. I stared at him across the table, this man I had married 8 years ago, and realized that I had been making excuses for his condescension for far too long. This was not about him having a different communication style, or being unable to relate to creative work because of his finance background. This was about him genuinely believing that my work was less valuable than his work, that helping children develop emotional intelligence and resilience was less important than helping wealthy people become wealthier through strategic investments. What I do matters, Marcus, I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. The books I write help children through some of the most difficult experiences of their lives. I get letters from parents telling me that my books gave their kids language to express feelings they were struggling with. Therapists use my books in their practices. Schools purchase them for their counseling offices. This is not nothing. He sighed, and the sigh told me that he thought I was being overly sensitive and defensive rather than rightfully proud of my accomplishments. I never said it was nothing, Sarah. You're putting words in my mouth. I think what you do is nice and helpful and I'm glad you enjoy it. I'm just saying that there are different levels of professional achievement, and different scales of impact. That's not a criticism, it's just reality. I work with clients who manage hundreds of millions of dollars. The decisions I help them make affect pension funds and retirement accounts for thousands of people. Your books are lovely, but they're read by maybe a few thousand kids. That's just the math of it. I did not finish dinner. I excused myself and went to my studio, where I sat in my chair looking at the manuscript I had been working on. A story about a young girl whose older sister goes to college, and she has to learn to be brave without her constant companion. I had been so proud of the text I had crafted, the way I had captured the specific loneliness of that particular transition. Now Marcus's words echoed in my head. Your little books. Your hobby. A few thousand kids. As if that was insignificant rather than several thousand individual human beings whose emotional development I might positively influence. That night marked a shift in our relationship, though Marcus seemed entirely unaware of it. I stopped sharing details about my work with him. When I received my manuscript acceptance for my next book, I did not mention it at dinner. When I was invited to speak at a children's literature conference in San Francisco, I simply told him I would be away for the weekend without explaining why. When a prestigious review called my latest book, Essential Reading for Any Child Navigating Loss, I printed the review and pinned it to my studio wall, but did not show it to Marcus. I created a boundary between my professional life and our marriage, because I could no longer tolerate his subtle, but persistent dismissal of my work. Marcus did not seem to notice or care about this boundary. His own career continued its upward trajectory. He was being considered for promotion to senior vice president at Clearwater, which would put him in the top tier of leadership at the firm and significantly increase his already substantial compensation. He talked about this possible promotion constantly, strategizing about how to position himself, analyzing which clients he needed to cultivate relationships with, discussing the office politics that might affect the decision. I listened and asked appropriate questions and said encouraging things, playing the role of supportive spouse, even as I quietly seethed about the asymmetry in our relationship, where I was expected to enthusiastically champion his career, while he relegated mine to the category of pleasant hobbies. The corporate gala where everything changed was scheduled for mid-November at the Sentinel Hotel in downtown Portland, one of the city's most elegant venues. Clearwater Capital Management held this event annually for clients, employees, and key business partners, and it was considered an important networking opportunity, where careers could be advanced or damaged based on how well you performed in conversations with senior leadership and important clients. Marcus had been talking about the gala for weeks, explaining its significance and the key people he needed to make impressions on. He had specific instructions about my role at the event. I was to dress elegantly but not attention-seeking, to be friendly and charming in conversations but not dominating, to ask people questions about themselves rather than talking too much about my own work, and above all, to help him make a good impression on the partners and clients who would be evaluating him for the senior vice president promotion. Just be yourself, he said the week before the gala, but maybe the version of yourself that's more focused on listening than talking. These people aren't really interested in children's books, so if someone asks what you do, just keep it brief and then redirect to asking about them. I agreed to all of this, though something inside me resisted the implication that my work was so uninteresting that it should be mentioned only briefly before moving on to more important topics. I bought a new dress for the occasion, an elegant navy blue cocktail dress that was sophisticated without being flashy, exactly the kind of thing Marcus had indicated would be appropriate. I had my hair professionally styled, and wore the pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. I looked like exactly what I was. A successful professional woman in her mid-30s who had learned how to present herself appropriately in formal social situations. The gala itself was predictably elegant. The Sentinel's grand ballroom was decorated with tasteful floral arrangements and soft lighting that made everyone look attractive and successful. There was a jazz quartet playing standards in one corner, multiple bars serving premium cocktails and wines, and tables of elaborate appetizers circulating on silver trays carried by professional servers. The crowd was exactly what you would expect at a high-end financial services event. Men in expensive suits and women in designer dresses, everyone carefully groomed and strategically networking. Marcus immediately went into performance mode, working the room with practiced charm, and introducing me to various colleagues and clients. "This is my wife, Sarah," he would say, and people would smile politely and shake my hand and ask the obligatory question about what I do. And this is where the trouble began, because I watched Marcus's face as he prepared to answer on my behalf, and I saw the exact moment when he made the decision that would ultimately lead to his humiliation, and the revelation that would change everything between us. "Sarah does crafts," he said to a senior partner named Douglas Whitmore, dismissing 8 years of my professional work with 2 words that reduced me to someone who made things with glitter and popsicle sticks. "Children's books, actually," I corrected, my voice tight. "Oh, how charming," Douglas said with polite disinterest before turning back to Marcus to discuss a client matter. This pattern repeated throughout the evening. "Sarah works from home. Sarah does creative projects. Sarah writes little stories for kids." Each introduction was another paper cut, another small humiliation, another reminder that Marcus viewed my career as something quaint and minor rather than legitimate and valuable. The final straw came when Marcus introduced me to Richard Thornhill, the CEO of Clearwater Capital Management, and the person who would ultimately decide Marcus's promotion. Richard was in his early 60s, distinguished looking with silver hair, and the kind of presence that comes from decades of authority. He was standing with his wife, Catherine, an elegant woman with kind eyes who seemed genuinely interested when Richard asked me what I did. Before I could answer, Marcus jumped in. "Sarah does crafts at home. Makes children's books, draws pictures, that sort of thing. Keeps her busy while I'm at the office." He said it with a jovial tone, as if he was being affectionate rather than dismissive, as if reducing my career to a hobby that kept me occupied was somehow charming rather than insulting. I felt my face flush with anger and humiliation as Catherine's expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy or recognition. I opened my mouth to correct him, to explain that I was not someone who dabbled in crafts but rather a published author with multiple award-winning books and a 3-book contract with a major publisher. When Richard's expression changed entirely, he leaned forward slightly, studying my face with sudden intense interest. "Sarah Chun?" he asked. "You're S.C. Chun, the author of When the Colors Feel Too Loud?" The question hung in the air, and in that moment, everything shifted. Marcus looked confused, Catherine looked delighted, and I looked at Richard Thornhill and realized that somehow, impossibly, the CEO of my husband's company knew exactly who I was. The recognition in Richard Thornhill's eyes was unmistakable, and the shift in atmosphere around our small circle was immediate and profound. Marcus's confident smile faltered slightly as he registered that something unexpected was happening, something outside his carefully orchestrated script for the evening. Catherine Thornhill's expression brightened with genuine pleasure, and she reached out to touch my arm with the familiarity of someone who felt they already knew me through my work. "You wrote, When the Colors Feel Too Loud?" Catherine asked, her voice filled with emotion that seemed disproportionate to a casual conversation at a corporate event. "That book changed my grandson's life. He has severe sensory processing disorder, and before we found your book, he couldn't explain to us what he was experiencing. He would just have these meltdowns that seemed to come from nowhere, and we felt so helpless. Your book gave him language. He could point to the illustrations and show us what was happening inside his body and his mind." I felt a complex mixture of emotions wash over me in that moment. There was the pure professional satisfaction of hearing that my work had genuinely helped a child in need, which was always the ultimate goal of everything I created. There was the vindication of having my career recognized and valued by someone Marcus clearly respected, which felt both gratifying and sad that I needed this external validation to counter my husband's dismissiveness. And there was the dawning realization that Marcus had no idea this conversation was happening, no understanding of the significance of what was being discussed, because he had never bothered to learn the details of my professional achievements or the scope of my readership. "I'm so glad the book helped your grandson," I said to Catherine, my voice steadier than I felt. Children with sensory processing differences often have such rich internal experiences that they struggle to communicate. I worked with several occupational therapists and sensory integration specialists while developing that book to make sure the descriptions and coping strategies were accurate and helpful. Richard was nodding as I spoke, and I noticed that several other people had drifted closer to our conversation. drawn by whatever shift in energy they sensed. We bought copies for his school and his therapy center, Richard said. His occupational therapist now recommends it to every family she works with. She told us that it's become an essential resource in her practice. He turned to Marcus, who was standing very still beside me with an expression I could not quite read. Marcus, I had no idea your wife was fictional. Do you have any idea how significant her work is in the field of child development and therapeutic literature? Marcus's laugh was forced and uncomfortable. Well, I know Sarah writes children's books. She's very talented. I just didn't realize you were familiar with her work. The deflection was obvious and clumsy, and I watched Richard's expression shift slightly as he registered that Marcus had genuinely not known about this connection, or understood the significance of my career. There was a moment of awkward silence where everyone in our small circle seemed to be recalibrating their understanding of our relationship, and Marcus's earlier dismissive introduction of me, Catherine, with the social grace that comes from decades of navigating complicated interpersonal dynamics, smoothly redirected the conversation. Sarah, I would love to talk with you more about your work. Our foundation funds literacy programs and therapeutic resources for children, and I think there might be some wonderful opportunities for collaboration. Would you be willing to meet with me sometime next week to discuss some ideas I have? She pulled out her phone with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making things happen quickly. Let me get your contact information. As Catherine and I exchanged phone numbers and email addresses, I was acutely aware of Marcus standing beside me, his body language becoming increasingly rigid. The evening he had planned so carefully, where he would shine in front of his CEO and position himself for promotion, had been disrupted by his wife's unexpected recognition. Instead of being the supportive but unremarkable spouse who helped him look good, I had become the center of attention in a way that clearly made him uncomfortable. Other people began approaching us, drawn by the conversation with Richard and Catherine. A woman named Jennifer who worked in Clearwater's marketing department mentioned that she had given my book, The House with Two Doors, to her niece when her sister got divorced, and it had helped the whole family navigate that difficult transition. A client named Thomas talked about how his daughter's elementary school used several of my books in their social-emotional learning curriculum. A partner named Patricia asked detailed questions about my research process and my collaboration with child psychologists and educators. With each conversation, I watched Marcus's discomfort grow. He would try to interject comments about my work, attempting to reclaim some authority in the discussion, but it became increasingly obvious that he knew very little about what I actually did or the impact my books had achieved. When Patricia asked about the awards my books had won, Marcus started to answer but stumbled over the names, and had to defer to me for the correct information. When Thomas asked about my upcoming publications, Marcus admitted he was not sure what projects I was currently working on. Each admission was a small revelation of how little attention he had paid to my career, and I could see people registering this disconnect with expressions that ranged from puzzlement to disapproval. The evening continued, but the dynamic had fundamentally changed. Instead of being Marcus's accessory at his corporate event, I had become someone people wanted to talk with directly about my own work. Richard introduced me to several other clients and partners who had children or grandchildren who might benefit from my books. Catherine spent nearly 30 minutes discussing her foundation's work and how my expertise in creating therapeutic literature for children might inform some of their grant-making decisions. Other spouses at the event who had previously given me polite but disinterested greetings now approached me with genuine curiosity about my career. Marcus handled this shift with increasing awkwardness. He would hover at the edges of my conversations, trying to appear engaged and supportive, but clearly uncomfortable with no longer being the center of attention. When people asked him questions about my work that he could not answer, he would make jokes about how artists are mysterious about their creative process, or how he tried not to interfere with my workspace because he did not understand the chaos of the creative mind. These comments were clearly meant to be charming and self-deprecating, but they landed differently now that people understood the actual scope and significance of my career. Instead of seeming like an indulgent husband tolerating his wife's hobby, he seemed like someone who had failed to notice or value his spouse's substantial professional achievements. By the time we left the gala around 11 o'clock that evening, The tension between us was palpable. We walked to the parking garage in silence, Marcus's jaw tight and his movements stiff with suppressed emotion. The drive home through the dark Portland streets was equally silent until we were about halfway to our house, when Marcus finally spoke. "That was unexpected," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I didn't realize Richard's grandson used your books." The statement was so profoundly insufficient, so completely missing the actual issue, that I almost laughed. He thought the problem was that he had not known about this specific connection rather than understanding that he had spent years dismissing and diminishing my career without bothering to learn basic facts about my professional life. "Marcus, Richard's grandson is not the point," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "The point is that you introduced me to your CEO as someone who does crafts. You reduced 8 years of my professional work to a hobby that keeps me busy while you're at the office. You had no idea that I'm respected in my field, that my books are used in schools and therapy practices, that I've won significant awards, or that people in your own professional circle value my work enough to seek me out at a corporate event." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had an edge of defensiveness. "I didn't mean to minimize what you do, Sarah. I just didn't think people at a finance industry event would be interested in children's books. I was trying to keep the focus on networking and professional connections that would be relevant to the people there." The rationalization was so perfectly Marcus, reframing his dismissiveness as strategic thinking rather than acknowledging the disrespect inherent in his approach. "But people were interested," I countered. "Very interested. Richard and Catherine spent more time talking with me about my work than they spent talking with you about yours. And the reason you didn't know they would be interested is because you've never bothered to understand what I actually do or who my readers are. You've decided that my work is less important than yours, and you've never questioned that assumption long enough to learn that you might be wrong." Marcus pulled into our driveway and turned off the car, but neither of us moved to get out. We sat in the darkness of the garage, the automatic light casting harsh shadows across his face. "I think you're overreacting," he said finally. "So I didn't introduce you the way you wanted. So I didn't realize that Richard's family used your books. That doesn't mean I don't respect your work. You're being overly sensitive about this." The accusation of being overly sensitive, that classic deflection used by people who do not want to acknowledge that they have caused harm, finally broke through my attempt to remain calm. "I am not being overly sensitive, Marcus. I am being appropriately upset that my husband treats my career like a cute hobby while expecting me to enthusiastically support every detail of his professional life. Do you have any idea how humiliating it was to stand there while you told important people in your industry that I do crafts at home? Do you understand how small you tried to make me feel?" He turned to look at me then, and his expression was a mixture of frustration and something that might have been the first glimmer of understanding. "What do you want from me, Sarah? Do you want me to apologize? Fine, I apologize. I should have introduced you better. I should have known more about your awards and your readership. I'm sorry. Can we move past this now?" The apology was perfunctory and defensive, lacking any real acknowledgement of the pattern of behavior that had led to this moment rather than just the specific incident at the gala. "I don't think we can just move past this," I said quietly. "This isn't about one bad introduction at one event. This is about the fact that you've spent years treating my work as less valuable than yours. You call my books my little stories. You refer to my career as a hobby. You have no idea what projects I'm working on, or what I've accomplished because you've never bothered to ask or pay attention. You've made it very clear that you think what you do matters more than what I do. And tonight that assumption was challenged in front of people whose opinions you care about, and you don't like how that feels." We went inside and prepared for bed with the mechanical motions of two people who had shared space long enough to have routines, but who were no longer truly connected. Marcus showered first, and was already in bed with his back to my side when I finished in the bathroom. I lay awake for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the evening's events, and what they revealed about the state of my marriage. The recognition from Richard and Catherine had been gratifying, certainly, but it had also illuminated something I had been trying to ignore for years. Marcus did not respect my work, and by extension, he did not fully respect me. He valued me as his wife in the sense that I performed the social and domestic functions he expected, But he did not value me as a professional equal or recognize my achievements as legitimate measures of success. I had been tolerating this dynamic by creating separation between my professional life and our marriage, but the gala had forced these two spheres to collide, and the collision had revealed the fundamental disconnect in how we viewed each other and our respective contributions to the world. The next morning was Saturday, and we moved around each other carefully, both of us avoiding the conversation we probably needed to have. Marcus went to the gym, his usual weekend routine, and I went to my studio to work on the manuscript I had been developing. But I found it difficult to focus on the story I was trying to tell about a young boy learning to manage his anger after a traumatic experience. My mind kept returning to the previous evening, replaying conversations and analyzing expressions, and trying to understand what came next for Marcus and me. My phone buzzed with a text message around 10 o'clock. It was from Catherine Thornhill, following up on her offer to meet and discuss potential collaboration with her foundation. She suggested lunch on Tuesday at a restaurant downtown, and said she was eager to hear my thoughts on some programs she was hoping to develop. I confirmed the meeting and felt a surge of professional excitement mixed with the complicated emotions surrounding how this opportunity had emerged from my husband's public dismissal of my work. Marcus returned from the gym around 11, and I could tell from his body language that he had been thinking about our argument during his workout. He had that particular tension in his shoulders that meant he was preparing to have a difficult conversation. We made coffee together in our kitchen, the domestic intimacy of the shared task feeling strange given the emotional distance between us. "I've been thinking about last night," he said finally, leaning against the kitchen counter with his coffee mug. "You're right that I should know more about your career and what you've accomplished. I let work consume too much of my attention, and I haven't been as supportive as I should be. I'm going to do better." The words were appropriate, but something about the delivery felt rehearsed rather than genuine, as if he had decided what he should say rather than speaking from authentic understanding. "I appreciate that," I said carefully. "But Marcus, this isn't just about you knowing more facts about my career. It's about you genuinely respecting the work I do and understanding that it has value even though it doesn't operate on the same financial scale as your work. Can you honestly say that you view my books as being as important as your investment analysis?" I watched him struggle with the question, wanting to give me the answer I wanted to hear but unable to quite commit to it fully. "I think they're different kinds of important," he said finally. "What I do affects people's financial security and retirement planning. What you do affects children's emotional development. Those are both valuable, but they're not really comparable." It was a diplomatic answer, but it revealed that he still operated from the assumption that financial impact was the primary measure of significance, and everything else was important, in its own way, but not quite on the same level. Before I could respond, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his expression shifted to alert professionalism. "It's Richard," he said, moving toward his home office. "I need to take this." I watched him disappear into his office, closing the door behind him, and felt the familiar pattern reasserting itself, where his work took precedence over our conversation, and his professional relationships commanded immediate attention while our marriage could wait. I returned to my studio and tried again to focus on my manuscript, but my mind was elsewhere. The events of the previous evening had catalyzed something in me, a recognition that I could no longer tolerate being diminished in my own marriage. I had spent years making excuses for Marcus's dismissiveness, telling myself that he was just focused on his career, or that he showed his support in other ways, or that our different professional worlds made it natural that he would not fully understand my work. But the gala had stripped away those rationalizations and forced me to confront the simple truth that my husband did not think my career mattered very much, and he was not particularly interested in changing that view. Marcus emerged from his office about 20 minutes later, and his expression was complicated in a way that immediately caught my attention. He looked excited and stressed simultaneously. The particular combination that usually meant something significant had happened at work. "Richard wants to meet with me Monday morning," he said. "He said he wants to discuss my trajectory at the firm and some opportunities he's been considering for me. Sarah, I think this might be about the senior vice president promotion." The gala must have gone even better than I thought. I stared at him. This man who had just had a phone call from his CEO following an event where he had publicly dismissed his wife's career, and who had somehow concluded that the evening had gone well for him professionally. He seemed genuinely oblivious to the possibility that Richard's perspective on him might have been affected by witnessing how little Marcus understood or valued his spouse's significant professional achievements. The disconnect was so profound that I did not even know how to begin addressing it. "That's great, Marcus," I said, my voice flat. "I hope the meeting goes well." He did not seem to notice my lack of enthusiasm, too caught up in his own excitement about the possible promotion and what it would mean for his career and our financial situation and his status within the firm. He spent the rest of the day strategizing about the Monday meeting, talking through his approach and his talking points and the image he wanted to project. I listened and made appropriate responses and felt the distance between us growing with each passing hour. Sunday passed in a similar fashion, with Marcus consumed by preparation for his meeting with Richard, and me increasingly withdrawn into my own work and thoughts. I found myself observing our interactions with new clarity, noticing patterns that had been there all along, but that I had trained myself not to see. The way he would interrupt me when I was speaking to check his phone for work messages. The way he would ask perfunctory questions about my day, but not wait for detailed answers. The way he spoke about his colleagues and clients with respect and interest, but spoke about my publishers and readers with polite condescension. The way he expected me to be enthusiastic about every development in his career, but offered only vague encouragement for mine. By Monday morning, I had reached a point of crystalline clarity about my marriage and what it had become. I was not sure yet what I was going to do about this clarity, but I could no longer deny it or rationalize it away. Marcus left early for his meeting with Richard, wearing his best suit and radiating confidence about his professional future. He kissed me absently on his way out the door, and said he would text me after the meeting to let me know how it went. I watched him leave and wondered if he had any sense that his personal life was on much shakier ground than his professional life, and suspected that even if he did sense it, he would not consider it as important as his career trajectory. I spent Monday morning working on my manuscript and checking email, and trying not to obsessively refresh my phone waiting for Marcus's text about his meeting. Catherine had sent me a detailed message about the lunch we had planned for Tuesday, outlining some of the Foundation's current initiatives, and asking some preliminary questions about my thoughts on using literature as a therapeutic tool for children experiencing trauma. Her message was thoughtful and engaged, asking substantive questions about my work that demonstrated genuine interest and understanding. The contrast with Marcus's superficial engagement with my career could not have been more stark. Marcus's text finally came through around 11:30. Meeting went longer than expected. Heading back to office. Talk tonight. The brevity and lack of detail told me nothing about how the conversation with Richard had actually gone, but I sensed that it had not been the triumphant discussion of promotion that Marcus had anticipated. Something in the tone, even in those few words, suggested that he had been surprised by the direction the meeting had taken. When Marcus came home that evening, his demeanor confirmed my suspicions. He was subdued and slightly defensive, the energy of someone who had received feedback they had not expected and did not particularly want to discuss. We sat down to the dinner I had prepared, and I waited for him to volunteer information about his day. When he did not, I finally asked directly, "How did your meeting with Richard go?" The question seemed to make him uncomfortable, and he took his time cutting his chicken and arranging his response before speaking. "It was fine. Good actually. Richard had some feedback about my performance and some thoughts about my development areas." The corporate jargon was a tell that he was being evasive, hiding behind professional language rather than telling me what had actually been discussed. "What kind of feedback?" I pressed gently. Marcus sighed and set down his fork, and when he looked at me, I saw frustration and embarrassment in his expression. "Richard said that I'm excellent at financial analysis and client management, and he values my contributions to the firm. But he also said that leadership at the senior vice president level requires certain interpersonal skills and awareness that I need to develop further. He said that watching me at the gala made him question whether I have the maturity and perspective necessary for the role he had been considering me for." Marcus spoke quickly, as if rushing through the words would make them less painful. He suggested that I might benefit from some executive coaching around emotional intelligence and relationship management. I absorbed this information carefully, understanding that Richard had essentially told Marcus that his treatment of me at the gala had raised concerns about his character and judgment. What specifically did he say about the gala? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly reluctant to repeat Richard's exact words. He said that he was disappointed to see how I introduced you and how little I seemed to know about your significant professional achievements. He said that a leader needs to recognize and celebrate excellence in all forms, not just in areas they personally work in. He said that my dismissiveness toward your career suggested a narrow worldview that would limit my effectiveness in a senior role, where I would need to evaluate diverse kinds of value and potential. Marcus recited this as if he were reading from a performance review, his voice tight with controlled emotion. He also said, Marcus continued, that Catherine was quite upset by the way I spoke about you, and she raised concerns about whether someone who would publicly diminish their spouse's accomplishments could be trusted to treat colleagues and subordinates with appropriate respect. Richard said that he needs more time to evaluate whether I'm ready for promotion, and in the meantime he wants me to work with an executive coach on developing greater appreciation for different kinds of professional contribution and achievement. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. Marcus's career advancement, which he valued above almost everything else, was now being jeopardized specifically because of how he had treated my career, which he had consistently devalued. The professional consequences he cared so much about were flowing directly from his personal choices and attitudes. It was a form of poetic justice that I had not anticipated, but that felt grimly appropriate given how long I had tolerated his condescension. The revelation that Marcus's promotion had been delayed specifically because of his treatment of me created a strange new dynamic in our household. I could see him struggling with conflicting emotions as he tried to process what had happened and what it meant for both his career and our relationship. There was embarrassment that his professional judgment had been questioned by someone he deeply respected. There was resentment that his personal life had become entangled with his career advancement in a way he found uncomfortable and invasive. And there was something that might have been the beginning of genuine reflection about how he had been treating me, though I remained skeptical about whether this reflection was motivated by authentic remorse or simply by the professional consequences he was facing. Over the following days, I watched Marcus move through various stages of response to his situation. Initially, he seemed to believe that the problem was primarily one of perception rather than substance. He would make comments suggesting that Richard had misunderstood his intentions at the gala, that people had been overly sensitive to his word choices, that the whole situation had been blown out of proportion by Catherine's emotional reaction to meeting me. This framing allowed him to maintain his essential worldview, while acknowledging that he needed to be more careful about how he presented himself in professional social settings. I think Richard is being influenced too much by Catherine's perspective, Marcus said one evening as we sat in our living room after dinner. She got emotional about your book helping their grandson, which is great, but that doesn't mean I did anything wrong by not knowing about that connection beforehand. How was I supposed to know that Richard's family used your books? It's not like you told me to research whether any of my colleagues' relatives were your readers. The deflection was characteristic of Marcus's approach to criticism. Rather than examining his own behavior and attitudes, he was looking for external factors that would explain why others had reacted negatively to his actions. He wanted to believe that the problem was Richard's judgment being clouded by family connections or Catherine's emotional response, rather than confronting the uncomfortable reality that his treatment of me had revealed something unflattering about his character and values. Marcus, the issue is not that you didn't know about Richard's grandson specifically, I said, trying to keep my voice patient even as I felt my frustration building. The issue is that you introduced me as someone who does crafts at home, as if my career is a hobby that keeps me occupied while you do the real work of earning our living. You demonstrated in front of your CEO and his wife that you have no understanding of what I actually do or the impact my work has. That is what concerned them, not the specific coincidence of their family using one of my books. He looked at me with an expression that mixed defensiveness with the first hints of genuine confusion, as if he was truly struggling to understand why his behavior had been problematic. But I was just trying to keep things simple and not bore people with too much detail about children's books at a finance industry event. I thought I was being strategic about maintaining focus on networking opportunities that would be relevant for my career. Why is that so terrible? The question revealed the depth of his misunderstanding. He genuinely seemed to believe that the problem was his communication strategy, rather than the underlying attitude that strategy reflected. He could not or would not see that calling my work crafts and dismissing it as irrelevant to serious professional networking was itself a profound statement about how little he valued what I did. His focus remained entirely on how his actions had been perceived and what consequences they had created for him, rather than on how those actions had made me feel, or what they said about our relationship. I found myself observing Marcus with a kind of detached curiosity during this period, as if I were studying a subject for one of my books rather than navigating my own marriage. I noticed how consistently he centered himself in every conversation about the situation. When he talked about the gala, he focused on how uncomfortable he had felt when people were more interested in talking with me than with him. When he discussed his meeting with Richard, he emphasized his own disappointment and frustration rather than considering how his behavior might have affected me or what it revealed about his character. When he mentioned the executive coaching Richard had suggested, he framed it as an unfair professional burden rather than an opportunity for growth and self-examination. This self-centeredness was not new. I realized as I paid closer attention that it had always been a feature of Marcus's personality, but I had excused it or worked around it for so long that I had stopped consciously noticing it. He had always been the protagonist of his own story in a way that left little room for other people to be fully realized characters with their own significant narratives. I had accepted a supporting role in his story for years, and it had taken the public nature of the gala incident to make me recognize how thoroughly I had diminished myself to accommodate his ego. My lunch with Catherine Thornhill on Tuesday provided a stark contrast to my interactions with Marcus. Catherine met me at an elegant restaurant in the Pearl District, arriving exactly on time and greeting me with warmth that felt genuine rather than performative. She had clearly done substantial preparation for our meeting, bringing a leather portfolio filled with notes and materials about her foundation's work and specific questions about how therapeutic literature could be integrated into various programs they funded. "I want to start by apologizing for what happened at the gala," Catherine said after we had ordered our meals. "I could see how uncomfortable Marcus's introduction made you, and I should have intervened more directly rather than just trying to redirect the conversation. Richard and I talked about it extensively afterward, and we both felt that the situation revealed some concerns about Marcus's judgment and character that needed to be addressed." Her directness surprised me. I had expected a more circumspect conversation that danced around the actual incident, but Catherine was approaching the topic with straightforward honesty that I found refreshing. "You have nothing to apologize for," I assured her. "If anything, I am grateful that you and Richard recognized the significance of what happened." I had been telling myself for years that Marcus's dismissiveness toward my work was not a big deal, but having it displayed so publicly made it impossible to ignore anymore. Catherine nodded with understanding. "I have been married to Richard for 38 years, and one thing I have learned is that how someone treats their spouse in professional settings reveals a great deal about their character and their capacity for leadership. Richard has seen many talented professionals fail to advance because they lack the emotional intelligence to recognize and value different kinds of excellence. When we saw Marcus diminishing your significant achievements, it raised real questions about whether he has the perspective necessary for senior leadership." We spent the next 2 hours discussing her foundation's work and potential collaborations. Catherine explained that the Thornhill Family Foundation focused on supporting programs that helped children who had experienced trauma, loss, or significant life disruptions. They funded counseling services, educational support programs, and therapeutic interventions, but Catherine was particularly interested in exploring how literature could serve as a therapeutic tool and a way to help children process difficult experiences. "Your books do something remarkable," Catherine said, her enthusiasm evident. "They give children both language and permission to talk about experiences that adults often want to shield them from. When our grandson could point to your illustrations and say, 'This is what I feel,' it opened up communication that had been completely blocked." His parents could finally understand what he was experiencing, and he could finally feel understood. That is transformative work, Sarah. The conversation filled me with professional satisfaction and validation that I had not realized I needed so desperately. Catherine asked substantive questions about my research methods, my collaboration process with child development experts, my approach to illustration and visual storytelling, and my thoughts on how books could be used most effectively in therapeutic contexts. She treated me as an expert in my field whose knowledge and experience had real value for the work her foundation was trying to do. We discussed several potential projects. Catherine was interested in funding the creation of books that address specific types of childhood trauma that were currently underrepresented in therapeutic literature. She talked about developing training programs for therapists, teachers, and social workers on how to use literature effectively in their work with children. She mentioned the possibility of translating some of my existing books into multiple languages to reach immigrant and refugee communities. Each idea was accompanied by serious discussion of funding, timeline, and implementation strategy, treating these as real professional initiatives rather than vague philanthropic gestures. By the time we finished lunch, we had outlined a potential partnership that could significantly expand the reach and impact of my work. Catherine suggested that I put together a formal proposal for a multi-year collaboration that would include creating new books, developing training materials and programs, and building a network of professionals who could effectively use therapeutic literature in their practice. The scope of what she was proposing was substantially larger than anything I had previously undertaken, and it represented both an exciting professional opportunity and a powerful validation of the significance of my career. I should mention, Catherine said as we prepared to leave, that Richard and I have talked about having you speak at Clearwater's next leadership retreat. We bring in outside experts several times a year to talk about topics that relate to leadership development and organizational culture. I think your perspective on communication, emotional intelligence, and recognizing diverse forms of value would be extremely relevant for the firm's senior leadership. Would you be interested in something like that? The irony of being invited to speak to Marcus's colleagues about topics that directly related to his professional development gaps was not lost on me. I agreed to consider the opportunity, and Catherine promised to have her assistant send me details about the retreat schedule and format. As we parted ways outside the restaurant, Catherine gave me a warm hug and said something that stayed with me for the rest of the day. You have built something important and meaningful, Sarah. Do not let anyone make you feel small because they lack the capacity to recognize what you have achieved. And do not settle for a relationship where you are not fully seen and valued for who you are. Her words were clearly meant to apply to my marriage as well as my career, and they gave me permission to acknowledge what I had been thinking, but not quite allowing myself to articulate. I drove home from lunch feeling energized and purposeful in a way I had not experienced in months. The conversation with Catherine had reminded me of why I did my work and what it meant to the children and families it reached. More than that, it had demonstrated what professional respect actually looked like when someone genuinely valued your expertise and wanted to learn from your knowledge. The contrast with how Marcus engaged with my career could not have been more pronounced. Marcus was working from home that afternoon, and when I arrived back at our house, I could hear him on a conference call in his office, his voice carrying that particular tone of controlled frustration that meant the call was not going well. I went to my studio and spent several hours working on my manuscript, but I found my mind wandering to the conversation with Catherine and the possibilities she had outlined. The potential partnership with her foundation represented not just professional growth, but also a kind of vindication, a concrete demonstration that my work had value and impact that extended far beyond what Marcus had ever acknowledged or understood. When Marcus emerged from his office around 5 o'clock, he looked stressed and irritable. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, which was unusual for a weekday afternoon, and sat down heavily on the living room sofa. I joined him, sensing that something significant had happened at work. Bad day? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Marcus took a long drink before responding, his jaw tight with tension. Richard assigned me to work with an executive coach starting next week. Some woman named Dr. Patricia Morrison who specializes in leadership development and emotional intelligence. I have to do weekly sessions for the next 3 months, and she will be giving Richard regular updates on my progress. It feels like I am being put on some kind of professional improvement plan, like I am a problem employee who needs remediation. The bitterness in his voice was palpable, and I could see that he viewed this coaching as punishment rather than opportunity. Maybe it will be helpful, I suggested carefully. You have always been focused on the technical aspects of your work, the financial analysis and strategy. This could be a chance to develop skills in areas that are equally important for leadership, but that do not come as naturally to you. Marcus looked at me with an expression that mixed frustration with something that might have been accusation. This is all because of what happened at the gala, you know. If you had not made such a big impression on Richard and Catherine, none of this would be happening. Richard would still be planning to promote me, and I would not be forced into coaching sessions like some kind of remedial student. The comment revealed so much about how Marcus was processing the situation. He had somehow managed to transform his own poor behavior into my fault, as if my professional success and the recognition it received were the problem rather than his dismissive treatment of me. The lack of accountability was breathtaking in its completeness. Marcus, this is happening because of how you introduced me and how you demonstrated that you neither understand nor value my career, I said, my voice harder than I had intended. If you had introduced me accurately and respectfully, if you had known basic facts about my professional achievements, if you had shown even minimal interest in my work, none of this would be an issue. The problem is not that I made a good impression. The problem is that you made a bad impression by treating your wife's significant career as if it were an irrelevant hobby. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him wrestling with whether to continue deflecting blame or to actually hear what I was saying. When he finally spoke, his voice was defensive but also carried the first notes of something that might have been genuine uncertainty. I did not think I was being that dismissive. I was just trying to keep things simple and professional. I did not realize that everyone would be so interested in children's books, or that they would judge me based on how I talked about your work. It feels like the rules changed and nobody told me. The statement revealed how thoroughly Marcus had misunderstood the situation, and how much he still centered himself in the narrative rather than considering my perspective or feelings. The rules did not change, Marcus. You just encountered consequences for behavior that has always been problematic, but that you never had to face before. You have been dismissing my career for years, calling my books my little stories and treating my work as if it were a pleasant hobby rather than a legitimate profession. The only thing that changed at the gala is that important people in your professional world witnessed your attitude and recognized it as a character flaw, rather than accepting it as normal. We sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes, the weight of unspoken tensions pressing down on both of us. I could see Marcus processing what I had said, his expression shifting through various emotions as he tried to reconcile his self-image with the feedback he was receiving from both his employer and his wife. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter and less defensive than before. Do you really think I have been that bad? That dismissive of what you do? The question seemed genuine, as if he was truly uncertain about how his behavior had come across over the years. The fact that he could ask this question after 8 years of marriage was itself revealing, demonstrating how little attention he had paid to my reactions and feelings about how he treated my work. Yes, Marcus, I do. You have consistently treated my career as less important than yours. You know almost nothing about what I actually do, what projects I am working on, what I have accomplished, or what my work means to the people it reaches. You have made it clear through your words and actions that you view your job as serious professional work, and my job as a creative hobby that occasionally makes some money. And that dismissiveness has been painful and isolating for me in ways I have been trying not to acknowledge because I did not want to create conflict in our marriage. Marcus absorbed this with visible discomfort, shifting in his seat and looking away from me toward the window where the late afternoon light was beginning to fade. When he looked back at me, there was something in his expression that I had not seen before, a kind of vulnerability or confusion that suggested his certainty about himself. And his worldview was genuinely shaken. I do not know how to fix this, he admitted. I do not know how to suddenly understand children's literature, or get interested in topics that have never engaged me. I work in finance because I am good with numbers and analysis and strategy, I am not creative or artistic or emotionally intuitive like you are. We are different kinds of people who do different kinds of work. I thought that was okay. I thought we could respect each other's differences without having to fully understand each other's fields. The statement was closer to honesty than Marcus usually managed, but it still revealed the fundamental problem. He framed the issue as being about different interests and aptitudes rather than recognizing it as a question of basic respect and value. He did not need to become an expert in children's literature or develop artistic sensibilities he did not naturally possess. He needed to recognize that work he personally did not understand or engage with could still be important and valuable, and he needed to treat his spouse's professional achievements with the respect they deserved regardless of whether they aligned with his own interests and priorities. You do not have to understand children's literature or become interested in topics that do not engage you naturally, I explained. But you do need to recognize that different kinds of work create different kinds of value, and that financial impact is not the only measure of significance. You need to respect that I have built a career that matters to the people it serves, even if it operates on a different scale and in a different sphere than your career. And you need to treat me as a professional equal rather than as a spouse whose work is a nice creative outlet, but not really serious. Marcus nodded slowly, but I could see that he was still struggling with the concept. His entire professional identity was built around quantifiable metrics and comparative rankings and hierarchical measures of success. The idea that excellence could exist in forms that did not fit neatly into those frameworks clearly challenged his fundamental way of understanding the world. I wondered if he was actually capable of the shift in perspective that our marriage needed, or if his worldview was too rigid to accommodate genuine respect for work that did not resemble his own. Over the following week, I watched Marcus make tentative efforts to engage more with my career. He would ask questions about what I was working on, though the questions were often superficial and suggested he was checking a box rather than feeling genuine curiosity. He looked at my website and social media presence, commenting with apparent surprise about the number of followers I had and the engagement my posts received. He mentioned to his parents during a phone call that I had won awards for my books, delivering this information as if it were news he had just learned rather than accomplishments that had occurred years ago while we were married. These efforts felt performative rather than authentic, motivated by his desire to satisfy Richard's concerns about his interpersonal skills rather than by genuine interest in understanding and valuing my work. I appreciated that he was trying, but I could see that the trying was effortful and uncomfortable for him, requiring him to act against his natural inclinations rather than reflecting any fundamental change in how he viewed my career or our relationship. It reminded me of how he would occasionally help with household chores when he knew I was particularly frustrated about the division of labor, making a show of contributing while clearly viewing it as a special favor rather than his normal responsibility. His first session with Dr. Patricia Morrison, the executive coach Richard had assigned, took place on Thursday afternoon. Marcus came home from that meeting looking thoughtful and somewhat unsettled, the expression of someone who had been asked questions they found difficult to answer. When I asked how it had gone, he was uncharacteristically reticent, saying only that Dr. Morrison had given him some homework assignments to complete before their next session. What kind of homework? I asked, curious about what approach the coach was taking. Marcus hesitated before answering, clearly uncomfortable with sharing the details. She wants me to interview you about your career. She gave me a list of questions to ask about your work, your achievements, your goals, and your experience of how I engage with your professional life. Then I am supposed to write a reflection about what I learn and how it compares to my previous understanding. He looked at the paper he had pulled from his briefcase, a printed list of questions that Dr. Morrison had prepared. She said that one of my development areas is the ability to genuinely see and understand perspectives that are different from my own, especially in contexts where I do not have natural expertise or authority. The assignment was clever, I had to admit. Rather than lecturing Marcus about respecting his wife's career, Dr. Morrison was creating a structured process that would require him to actually listen and learn. The questions on her list were thoughtful and probing, designed to elicit substantive information about not just what I did, but how I experienced my work and our relationship. When do you want to do this interview? I asked, looking at the list of questions. There were more than 20, covering topics ranging from my creative process to my business strategy to my experience of being married to someone who worked in a completely different field. Dr. Morrison suggested we do it this weekend, when we both have time for an extended conversation without work pressures. She said I should approach it like I am trying to understand a complex business that operates very differently from my own industry, with genuine curiosity about how it functions and what makes it successful. Marcus looked at the assignment sheet with an expression that mixed resignation with something that might have been cautious interest. Saturday afternoon? I agreed, and we set aside time on Saturday for Marcus to conduct his homework interview. The formality of the structure felt strange given that these were conversations we should have been having naturally throughout our marriage, but I was willing to participate if it might actually lead to some meaningful change in how Marcus understood and valued my work. At minimum, it would force him to listen to detailed explanations of what I did and why it mattered, which was more sustained attention than he had paid to my career in years. Friday brought another significant development. I received an email from Richard Thornhill's assistant, formally inviting me to speak at Clearwater Capital Management's leadership retreat in January. The retreat was a 3-day event at a resort on the Oregon coast, where the firm's partners and senior leaders gathered for strategic planning and professional development. I was being asked to deliver a keynote presentation on recognizing and valuing diverse forms of excellence. Lessons from therapeutic literature and child development. The invitation included a speaking fee that was substantially more than I typically earned for author appearances, along with travel and accommodation coverage, and a detailed brief about the audience and their development priorities. The brief made clear that Richard had been thinking carefully about how my expertise related to leadership challenges at his firm, particularly around issues of inclusive leadership, recognizing talent in unconventional forms, and building organizational cultures that valued different kinds of contribution. I sat in my studio reading and rereading the invitation, struck by the surreal nature of the situation. My husband's employer was hiring me to teach his colleagues about concepts that directly addressed my husband's professional development needs. I would be standing in front of the partners and senior leaders of Clearwater Capital Management, explaining why it was important to recognize and value excellence in fields they might not personally understand or work in themselves. Marcus would potentially be in that audience, listening to his wife deliver expertise about topics where he had demonstrated significant gaps. The irony was almost overwhelming, but it also felt like a kind of poetic justice. For years, Marcus had treated my work as if it existed in a completely separate and less important sphere from his professional life. Now those spheres were colliding in ways he could never have anticipated, and my expertise was being recognized as valuable specifically for helping address the kind of limited perspective that had delayed his promotion. His employer was essentially paying me to teach lessons that Marcus himself needed to learn. I accepted the speaking invitation that afternoon, composing a professional response that expressed my interest in the topic and my appreciation for the opportunity to share my perspective with Clearwater's leadership team. I copied Marcus on the email, wanting him to learn about this development directly from me rather than hearing about it through the firm's communications. When he came home from work that evening, he mentioned receiving the email, his voice carefully neutral. "So you are going to speak at our leadership retreat," he said, neither question nor statement. "Richard's assistant said you accepted the invitation." "Yes, I thought it would be an interesting opportunity. Catherine and I have been discussing how my work relates to broader questions about leadership and organizational culture, and this retreat seems like a good forum for exploring those connections." I kept my tone professional, matching his neutrality with my own. Marcus nodded slowly, processing this information, and clearly working through his own complex feelings about his wife becoming professionally involved with his employer. "What are you planning to talk about?" he asked, and I could hear both genuine curiosity and underlying anxiety in the question. Exactly what the invitation outlined. How leaders can recognize and value forms of excellence that exist in fields or contexts they do not personally work in or understand. How to avoid the trap of assuming that work which does not resemble your own work is therefore less important or valuable. How to build organizations where diverse kinds of expertise and contribution are genuinely respected rather than just tolerated. I watched his face as I spoke, seeing him register that these topics were not abstract leadership concepts, but direct reflections of the problems in our marriage and his professional development challenges. The weekend arrived with an atmospheric shift in our household that felt almost tangible. Marcus approached his assigned interview with me with the kind of methodical preparation he typically reserved for important client presentations. I observed him reviewing Dr. Morrison's question list multiple times throughout Friday evening and Saturday morning, making notes in the margins and occasionally looking up from the paper with an expression that suggested he was genuinely uncertain about how to approach this conversation with his own wife. Saturday afternoon, we settled into our living room for the interview. Marcus had prepared a notebook and several pens, arranged on the coffee table with the same precision he brought to his professional work. The formality of the setup was both absurd and somewhat touching, revealing that he was taking the assignment seriously even if the need for such structured inquiry into his spouse's career highlighted years of neglect and disinterest. Dr. Morrison said I should start by asking you to describe your work in your own words, without me making any assumptions or trying to categorize it based on my existing understanding. Marcus began, reading directly from his notes. She said I should listen without interrupting, and try to understand how you conceptualize what you do rather than imposing my own framework onto your description. The instruction itself was revealing, suggesting that Dr. Morrison had quickly identified Marcus's tendency to filter information through his own limited perspective rather than genuinely receiving what others were trying to communicate. I took a moment to consider how to answer, wanting to give him an accurate and comprehensive picture of my professional life that went beyond the superficial understanding he had maintained for years. I create therapeutic literature for children who are experiencing difficult life transitions or emotional challenges. I began, watching Marcus write notes as I spoke. My work sits at the intersection of several fields including child psychology, developmental science, art therapy, and literary craft. Each book I create begins with extensive research into a particular childhood experience or emotional challenge, whether that is grief, anxiety, family disruption, sensory processing differences, or other significant issues that children struggle to navigate and adults often struggle to help them with. Marcus was writing rapidly, and I could see him making notations that suggested he was trying to capture exact phrases rather than paraphrasing through his own understanding. I continued, explaining the months-long process of developing each book, the collaboration with child development experts and therapists, the careful attention to both written narrative and visual storytelling, and the ultimate goal of giving children both language and permission to express complex emotions they might not otherwise have words for. The business side of my work includes managing relationships with my publisher, negotiating contracts and rights, building and maintaining my platform through social media and speaking engagements, tracking sales and royalties, and strategic planning for future projects, I explained. I also consult with schools, libraries, and therapeutic practices about how to use literature effectively in supporting children's emotional development. The financial scale is smaller than what you work with at Clearwater, but the work requires sophisticated business judgment alongside the creative and psychological expertise. Marcus asked his next question from Dr. Morrison's list, which focused on what I considered my most significant professional achievements and why they mattered to me. I described the Charlotte Zolotow Award I had won, explaining what that recognition meant within the field of children's literature and how competitive and prestigious the honor was. I talked about letters I had received from parents and therapists describing how my books had helped specific children navigate trauma or loss or fear. I mentioned the growing adoption of my books in therapeutic and educational settings, and the way my work was increasingly being recognized as making genuine contributions to child development practice. What matters most to me is knowing that my work reaches children during moments when they desperately need help processing experiences that feel overwhelming. I said, aware that this kind of impact did not translate easily into the metrics Marcus typically valued. When a 6-year-old who has lost a parent can point to an illustration in one of my books and say this is how I feel inside, and that moment of recognition helps them and their surviving parent connect around their shared grief, that represents success in my field. When a child with anxiety learns coping strategies through a story character, and those strategies actually help them manage their fear, that is meaningful impact. Marcus was listening with an intensity one had rarely seen from him in conversations about my work. His questions became less scripted as the interview progressed, moving beyond Dr. Morrison's prepared list into territory that seemed to reflect genuine curiosity, or at least genuine effort to understand. He asked how I measured the success of my books beyond sales figures. He asked about the relationship between my artistic choices and the psychological goals I was trying to achieve. He asked what I found most challenging about my work and what I found most rewarding. When he reached the questions about our relationship and how I experienced his engagement with my career, the conversation became more difficult and emotionally charged. Dr. Morrison had crafted these questions carefully, asking me to describe specific instances where I had felt supported or unsupported, to explain what kind of engagement from Marcus would be meaningful to me, and to reflect on how his treatment of my work had affected both my professional confidence and our marital relationship. I answered honestly, describing the pattern of dismissive comments over the years, the way he knew almost nothing about what I was actually working on at any given time, the absence of genuine curiosity about my creative process or professional strategy. I explained how isolating it had been to build a meaningful career, while living with someone who treated that career as a pleasant hobby rather than legitimate professional work. I talked about the gala incident not as an isolated problem, but as the most public manifestation of an ongoing dynamic that had been damaging our relationship for years. Marcus listened to these answers with visible discomfort, occasionally stopping his note-taking to simply absorb what I was saying. I could see the information landing in ways that previous conversations had not managed to achieve, perhaps because the structure of the interview required him to listen without immediately defending himself or reframing my experience through his own perspective. When I finished answering the relationship questions, there was a long silence in our living room, broken only by the sound of rain beginning to fall outside. "I did not realize," Marcus said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "I did not understand that I had been making you feel that way. I thought I was being supportive by not interfering with your work, and by letting you use the sunroom for your studio, and by not complaining about the time you spent on your books. I did not see that what you needed was not just tolerance but genuine interest and respect." The statement represented more self-awareness than Marcus typically demonstrated, though I noted that he still framed his previous behavior as a misunderstanding rather than a choice. He had not accidentally failed to learn about my career or coincidentally avoided showing interest in my work. He had made consistent decisions over years that reflected his belief that my professional life was less important than his. And those decisions had created the dynamic we were now struggling with. "Tolerance is not the same as respect," I said, trying to help him understand the distinction. "You tolerated my career the way you might tolerate a spouse's hobby or volunteer work, something pleasant that they enjoy but that does not really matter in the larger scheme of things. What I needed was for you to recognize that I had built something significant and valuable, to be genuinely curious about my work, and to treat my professional achievements with the same seriousness you expect me to treat yours." Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon working on his written reflection for Dr. Morrison, occasionally asking me clarifying questions about things I had said during the interview. I left him to his homework and returned to my own studio, where I worked on revisions to my manuscript while processing the strange experience of having to formally educate my husband about my career through a structured assignment from his executive coach. The following week brought a succession of developments that continued to illuminate the growing gap between Marcus's self-perception and how others viewed him. His second coaching session with Dr. Morrison apparently involved extensive discussion of what he had learned from interviewing me, and what that revealed about his capacity to value perspectives and contributions different from his own. Marcus came home from that session looking thoughtful and somewhat chastened, reporting that Dr. Morrison had given him additional assignments, including reading several articles about inclusive leadership and cognitive diversity, and journaling about instances where he might have dismissed or undervalued colleagues whose work or approach differed from his own. Meanwhile, my collaboration with Catherine Thornhill's foundation was developing rapidly. I had submitted a detailed proposal for a multi-year partnership that included creating a series of new books addressing specific types of childhood trauma, developing training programs for professionals who worked with children, and building a network of practitioners who could effectively use therapeutic literature in their work. Catherine had responded enthusiastically, suggesting only minor modifications and indicating that her foundation's board would likely approve funding when they met the following month. The potential scope of this partnership was substantial, both in terms of financial resources and professional impact. The funding Catherine was proposing would allow me to work on significantly more ambitious projects than I had previously been able to undertake, expanding my reach and influence in ways that felt both exciting and validating. It represented a major evolution in my career, moving from working as an individual author to potentially building a larger infrastructure for therapeutic literature and professional training. I was also preparing for my speaking engagement at Clearwater's leadership retreat in January, researching the firm's culture and strategic priorities to ensure my presentation would be relevant and valuable for their specific context. Richard's assistant had sent me background materials about the company's diversity and inclusion initiatives, their leadership development philosophy, and the particular challenges they were trying to address around recognizing and promoting different types of talent and expertise. As I reviewed these materials, I began to understand more clearly why Richard had been so concerned about Marcus's behavior at the gala. Clearwater was actively working to build a more inclusive culture that valued diverse perspectives and contributions, recognizing that their traditional approach of promoting people who fit a narrow mold of financial expertise and analytical thinking was limiting their effectiveness and competitiveness. Marcus's dismissiveness toward my work, which existed completely outside his field of expertise, was exactly the kind of limited perspective the firm was trying to move beyond in their leadership. The irony of Marcus's situation became increasingly apparent as I prepared my presentation. He had been on track for promotion based on his strong technical skills and client management abilities, but his inability to recognize and value excellence in forms that differed from his own expertise had revealed a limitation that could constrain his effectiveness in senior leadership. The firm needed leaders who could build diverse teams, recognize unconventional talent, and create environments where different kinds of contribution were genuinely valued. Marcus's treatment of his own wife's distinguished career suggested he lacked these capacities, at least in their current form. I found myself reflecting on whether Marcus was actually capable of the kind of growth and change that our marriage needed, and that his career advancement required. His recent efforts to engage more with my work felt effortful and performative rather than reflecting genuine shift in his worldview. He was going through the motions that Dr. Morrison assigned and that Richard expected, but I was not convinced that he truly understood or accepted that work which looked different from his own could be equally valuable and important. Thursday evening brought an unexpected conversation that crystallized my growing concerns. Marcus had been working late at the office, returning home around 8 o'clock looking frustrated and tired. He poured himself a drink and sat heavily in the living room, clearly needing to vent about his day. I joined him, and he began describing a conflict that had emerged in one of his client relationships. I have been working with this tech startup client for 6 months, helping them structure their Series B funding round, Marcus explained. The founders are young early 30s, very smart technically but pretty naive about finance and business strategy. I have been guiding them through the process, explaining how to position their company for investors, helping them understand valuation and terms and all the complexities they were not equipped to navigate on their own. He paused to take a drink, his frustration evident. Today they told me they want to bring in another advisor, some consultant who specializes in mission-driven companies and social impact investing. They said they want to make sure their funding strategy aligns with their values and their commitment to social good, not just maximizing returns. I tried to explain that investors care about financial performance and growth potential, not fuzzy concepts about social impact, but they would not listen. They are going to waste money on this consultant, who will probably fill their heads with idealistic nonsense that will make them less attractive to serious investors. I listened to this story with growing clarity about why Marcus was struggling both professionally and personally. He could not seem to grasp that there were legitimate perspectives and priorities different from his own, that his clients might value things beyond pure financial optimization, or that expertise in areas he did not work in might actually be valuable and important. His dismissiveness toward the social impact consultant was structurally identical to his dismissiveness toward my work in therapeutic literature for children. Both involved expertise in domains he did not understand or personally value, and both triggered his assumption that his perspective was correct and alternative approaches were naive or irrelevant. Marcus, maybe your clients know their own business and their own values better than you do, I suggested carefully. Maybe they understand that building a sustainable company requires more than just financial engineering. Maybe the consultant they want to bring in has expertise that complements yours rather than contradicting it. Maybe different kinds of knowledge and perspective can coexist and actually strengthen the overall strategy. He looked at me with an expression that mixed surprise and defensiveness. You sound like Dr. Morrison now, he said, not entirely as a compliment. She keeps talking about how I need to be more open to different perspectives and less certain that my way is the only right way. But in finance, there are actual right and wrong approaches. There are strategies that work and strategies that fail. Being open-minded does not mean pretending that every perspective is equally valid, when some are clearly based on more expertise and experience than others. The statement revealed the core of Marcus's resistance to change. He equated recognition of diverse perspectives with relativism, as if acknowledging that people could have different valid priorities and approaches meant abandoning professional standards and expertise altogether. He could not seem to hold the idea that his financial expertise was valuable and important while simultaneously recognizing that other kinds of expertise were also valuable and important in their own domains. No one is saying that every perspective is equally valid or that expertise does not matter, I tried to explain. What Dr. Morrison is probably trying to help you understand is that expertise comes in many forms, and that your expertise in financial analysis does not make you the authority on every aspect of business strategy or human values. Your clients might have valid reasons for prioritizing social impact alongside financial returns, and the consultant they want to hire might have legitimate expertise in helping companies navigate those dual priorities. That does not diminish your value or expertise. It just means that complex challenges often require multiple kinds of knowledge. Marcus absorbed this with visible resistance, his body language defensive and his expression suggesting he found my explanation frustrating rather than illuminating. We dropped the subject, but the conversation had clarified something important for me. Marcus's struggle was not primarily about learning new information or developing new skills. It was about challenging a fundamental aspect of his identity and worldview. The belief that his way of understanding and evaluating the world was superior to other approaches, and that his expertise gave him authority to judge the value of work in domains he knew little about. This realization made me question whether the coaching process could actually produce meaningful change, or whether it would simply teach Marcus to better perform respect and openness while maintaining his underlying assumptions. I had seen him adapt his behavior in response to professional incentives before, learning to say the right things and make the appropriate gestures while his core attitudes remained unchanged. Would this situation be any different, or was I watching another performance designed to satisfy external requirements without reflecting genuine internal transformation? Friday brought news that forced these questions into even sharper focus. Marcus received an email from Richard's assistant informing him that his promotion to senior vice president was being formally postponed for at least 6 months, with the decision to be revisited after his completion of the executive coaching program, and based on demonstrated growth in his leadership capabilities. The email was professionally worded, but clear in its implications. Marcus's technical excellence and client relationships were valued, but concerns about his interpersonal judgment and limited perspective were significant enough to delay his advancement until he could show meaningful progress in these areas. Marcus was devastated by this news in a way I had rarely seen him affected by professional setbacks. He had been so confident about the promotion, so certain that his technical skills and track record would carry him forward regardless of the concerns raised after the gala. The reality that his career advancement was genuinely contingent on personal growth he had not yet achieved was profoundly disorienting for him. He spent the evening in his home office, ostensibly working but actually staring at his computer screen while processing this unexpected blow to his professional trajectory. I felt a complex mixture of emotions as I observed Marcus's distress. There was sympathy for his disappointment and recognition that having one's career stalled is genuinely difficult regardless of the circumstances. There was also a certain satisfaction that he was finally experiencing meaningful consequences for attitudes and behaviors that had been damaging our relationship for years. And there was uncertainty about whether this setback would catalyze genuine change, or would simply deepen his resentment and resistance. Saturday morning, Marcus emerged from his home office looking exhausted and troubled. He found me in my studio where I was working on illustrations for my current manuscript, and he stood in the doorway watching me work for several minutes before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Do you think I can actually change? Do you think I can develop the kind of perspective and awareness that Richard and Dr. Morrison are talking about? Or is this just who I am, and everyone is expecting me to become someone fundamentally different?" The question was more vulnerable than Marcus typically allowed himself to be, suggesting that the postponed promotion had genuinely shaken his certainty about himself. I set down my brush and turned to face him, considering how to answer honestly, while also acknowledging the genuine difficulty of what he was being asked to do. "I think you can develop greater awareness and appreciation for perspectives different from your own," I said carefully. "But it will require genuine effort and genuine openness to challenging some of your fundamental assumptions about value and importance, and what kinds of work matter. You will have to accept that being excellent at financial analysis does not make you qualified to judge the significance of work in completely different fields. You will have to recognize that your spouse built a distinguished career that deserves your respect regardless of whether it resembles or interests you personally." Marcus nodded slowly, absorbing this assessment. "What if I do all that work and it is still not enough? What if I complete the coaching and Richard still decides I do not have what it takes for senior leadership? What if I change and grow and it does not actually fix what is broken?" The question contained layers of meaning, applying simultaneously to his career concerns and to our marriage. I understood that he was asking not just whether he could satisfy Richard's requirements for promotion, but also whether he could repair the damage his attitudes had caused in our relationship. The answer to both questions was uncertain, and I was not willing to provide false reassurance. "I cannot predict what Richard will decide about your promotion," I said honestly. "But I can tell you that whether or not you advance at Clearwater, developing the capacity to recognize and value different kinds of excellence will make you a better leader and a better person. And I can tell you that our marriage needs you to do this work regardless of what happens with your career. The way you have treated my professional life has been genuinely damaging, Marcus. The coaching might help you understand why and how to do better, but ultimately you have to decide whether you genuinely want to change, or whether you are just going through motions to satisfy external requirements." We stood in silence for a moment, the morning light streaming through my studio windows illuminating the space where I had spent countless hours building the career he had dismissed for so long. Marcus looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time, taking in the artwork on the walls, the manuscripts in various stages of development, the professional equipment and materials that represented substantial investment in my craft. "I really did not understand," he said quietly. "I did not understand what you built here, or what it meant or why it mattered. I thought I was being reasonable and realistic by recognizing that our careers operated on different scales with different kinds of impact. I did not see that I was being dismissive and condescending. Or maybe I did not want to see it because seeing it would have required me to question assumptions that made me comfortable." The admission was more self-aware than I had expected, suggesting that the combination of professional consequences and structured coaching might actually be penetrating Marcus's defenses in ways that my direct feedback over the years had failed to achieve. Whether this emerging awareness would translate into sustained change remained to be seen, but it represented at least the possibility of genuine growth rather than just performative adjustment. The weeks following Marcus's postponed promotion brought a noticeable shift in the atmosphere of our household. Marcus approached his executive coaching sessions with what appeared to be genuine commitment rather than merely checking boxes to satisfy his employer's requirements. He completed Dr. Morrison's assignments with thoroughness that suggested he was actually engaging with the material rather than rushing through exercises to finish them. He read the leadership articles she assigned and wrote thoughtful reflections that examined his own behavior patterns and assumptions. He began asking me questions about my work that seemed motivated by authentic curiosity, rather than obligation. I observed these changes with cautious optimism, aware that sustained transformation was different from initial enthusiasm. Marcus had always been capable of intense focus when he believed something was important for his goals, and I remained uncertain whether his current engagement with personal development reflected genuine value shift or strategic effort to remove obstacles to his career advancement. The distinction mattered enormously for both his professional trajectory and our marriage, but it would take time to determine which motivation was actually driving his behavior. During this period, I was simultaneously experiencing significant professional growth that created an interesting counterpoint to Marcus's struggles. The proposal I had submitted to Catherine Thornhill's foundation had been approved by their board with enthusiastic support and full funding for the 3-year initiative I had outlined. The partnership would provide substantial resources for creating new therapeutic literature, developing professional training programs, and building infrastructure to support practitioners who use literature in their work with children experiencing trauma and difficult transitions. Catherine called me personally to share the news of the board's decision, her voice filled with excitement about what we could accomplish together. She explained that several board members had been moved by the descriptions of how my existing books had helped children in their own families and communities, and they saw this partnership as an opportunity to significantly expand access to these therapeutic resources. The foundation was committed not just to funding my creative work, but to ensuring that the books and training materials we developed would reach the children and families who most needed them, including underserved communities that often lacked access to mental health resources. This is exactly the kind of initiative our foundation was created to support, Catherine said during our phone conversation. Work that makes real difference in children's lives, that combines rigorous expertise with genuine compassion, and that has potential for sustainable impact beyond any single intervention. Sarah, you have built something remarkable, and we are honored to partner with you in expanding its reach and influence. The validation and support from Catherine and her foundation stood in stark contrast to the years of dismissiveness I had experienced from Marcus. Here was someone who fully understood the significance of my work, who recognized the expertise and dedication it required, and who wanted to invest substantial resources in helping me achieve even greater impact. The professional relationship with Catherine was characterized by mutual respect, genuine curiosity, and shared commitment to goals that mattered deeply to both of us. It represented everything that had been missing from how Marcus engaged with my career, and the contrast illuminated just how impoverished our dynamic had become. I signed the partnership agreement with the Thornhill Foundation in mid-December, beginning what would be the most ambitious phase of my professional life. The work ahead was substantial and somewhat daunting, requiring me to scale up my operations significantly while maintaining the quality and therapeutic integrity that had made my existing books effective. I would need to hire research assistants to help with the expanded scope of projects, consult with additional child development experts to ensure accuracy across a broader range of traumatic experiences, and develop curriculum materials for the professional training programs we plan to offer. Marcus was present when I received the executed partnership agreement and the initial funding transfer that accompanied it. I had set up a dedicated business account for the foundation partnership, and watching the substantial deposit appear in that account was both thrilling and slightly surreal. This was not a royalty check from my publisher or payment for a speaking engagement. This was major funding for a multi-year initiative that someone else believed in enough to invest significantly in its success. That is a substantial amount of money, Marcus observed, looking at the deposit confirmation on my computer screen. His tone was complicated, mixing congratulation with something that might have been surprise, or even discomfort at the concrete financial validation of work he had long dismissed as modest creative activity. The foundation is making a serious investment in expanding therapeutic literature resources for children, I explained, feeling pride in what I had built and what I was about to undertake. This funding will support creating 8 new books over the next 3 years, developing comprehensive training materials for therapists and educators, and building a network of practitioners who can effectively use these resources in their work with children. It represents recognition that this work has significant value and potential for meaningful impact. Marcus nodded, and I could see him processing this information and what it meant for his understanding of my career. The financial scale of the foundation partnership was impossible to dismiss or minimize in the way he had learned to do with my publishing advances and royalty payments. This was institutional investment in my expertise at a level that commanded respect even by the metrics Marcus typically used to evaluate professional achievement. The cognitive dissonance this created was visible on his face, as he struggled to reconcile this reality with his long-standing assumption that my work operated on a much smaller and less significant scale than his own. "Congratulations," he said finally, and the word carried multiple layers of meaning. There was genuine acknowledgement of my achievement, but also perhaps recognition that he had fundamentally misunderstood what I had been building all along. "This is obviously a significant opportunity. I am glad your work is getting this kind of recognition and support." The comment was more gracious than I had expected, suggesting that Marcus was genuinely trying to shift his perspective even when doing so required him to confront how wrong his previous assessments had been. I appreciated the effort, though I remained aware that acknowledging my success in this moment did not erase years of dismissiveness or automatically repair the damage that dismissiveness had caused in our relationship. My preparations for the Clearwater Capital Management Leadership Retreat continued throughout December. I spent considerable time crafting my presentation to ensure it would be both intellectually substantive and practically applicable for the audience of financial services professionals who would attend. The challenge was translating concepts from child development, therapeutic practice, and creative work into frameworks and language that would resonate with people whose professional experience was entirely in business and finance. I structured my presentation around case studies that illustrated how recognizing diverse forms of excellence had created value in various organizational contexts. I included examples from my own field of children's literature, showing how collaboration between professionals with very different kinds of expertise had produced books that were more therapeutically effective than any single discipline could have created alone. I drew parallels to business situations where teams that valued cognitive diversity and different professional backgrounds outperformed homogeneous teams, even when the homogeneous teams had stronger credentials in the specific technical domain. The theoretical foundation came from research on inclusive leadership, cognitive diversity, and organizational learning. I incorporated findings from management studies showing that leaders who could recognize and value contributions from people with different backgrounds and expertise were more effective at building innovative teams and adapting to complex challenges. I included data on how organizations that promoted people based solely on narrow technical excellence often struggled with the broader strategic and interpersonal challenges of senior leadership. As I worked on this presentation, I became increasingly aware that I was essentially diagnosing the problems that had led to Marcus's delayed promotion and offering frameworks for how he and his colleagues might develop the capacities they were lacking. The meta-level irony of this situation was not lost on me. Marcus's employer was paying me substantial fees to teach lessons that Marcus himself had failed to learn from his own wife despite years of marriage. The firm recognized value in my expertise that Marcus had consistently dismissed, and they were creating a formal platform for me to share that expertise with their leadership team, including Marcus himself. Richard Thornhill's assistant reached out in mid-December to discuss logistics for the retreat, and to ask whether I would be comfortable with my presentation being recorded for use in future leadership development programs at the firm. The request suggested that Clearwater saw lasting value in what I would be presenting, not just a one-time speaking engagement, but potentially an ongoing resource for their organizational culture initiatives. I agreed to the recording with the stipulation that it could only be used internally for leadership development purposes, and not distributed externally without my explicit permission. The conversation with Richard's assistant also revealed that my speaking slot had been positioned as the keynote presentation on the second day of the retreat, the prime speaking opportunity when attendees would be most engaged and receptive. This placement signaled that the firm's leadership viewed my content as central to the retreat's purpose rather than supplementary or optional. Partners and senior leaders would be required to attend my session, and there would be structured discussion and reflection activities following my presentation to help participants apply the concepts to their own leadership practice. Marcus learned about these details through the retreat agenda that was distributed to all attendees in mid-December. I watched him review the document at our kitchen table one evening, Seeing his expression shift as he absorbed the information about my prominent role in the event and the mandatory nature of attendance at my session. He looked up from the agenda with an expression I could not quite read, something mixing pride with discomfort with perhaps a hint of embarrassment. "Your presentation is positioned as one of the centerpiece sessions of the retreat," he observed, his voice carefully neutral. "Richard clearly thinks what you have to say is very important for the firm's leadership." Catherine and Richard both believe that issues around recognizing diverse forms of excellence and building inclusive leadership are critical for Clearwater's future, I replied, matching his neutral tone. They see connections between these organizational challenges and the expertise I have developed through my work in therapeutic literature and child development. I am glad they think my perspective will be valuable for their leadership team. Marcus set down the agenda and looked at me directly, his expression more open than usual. "Are you going to talk about me? About what happened at the gala and how I treated your work? Is this presentation going to be essentially a case study in how not to be a leader, using your own husband as the cautionary example?" The question revealed anxiety that had probably been building since he first learned about my speaking invitation. He was worried about being humiliated in front of his colleagues, about having his failures put on public display as teaching examples. The concern was understandable even if it reflected his characteristic focus on how situations affected him rather than considering the broader context or other people's perspectives. "My presentation will not be about you specifically or about our marriage," I assured him. "I am not interested in publicly shaming you or using our personal relationship as material for a business presentation. However, the concepts I will be discussing are directly relevant to the concerns Richard raised about your readiness for senior leadership. The presentation will address exactly the kinds of awareness and perspective that you have been working on developing through your coaching. Whether you experience that as uncomfortable or useful is largely up to you and how you choose to engage with the material." Marcus absorbed this with visible relief mixed with continued apprehension. The retreat was scheduled for mid-January, about a month away, giving him time to continue his work with Dr. Morrison, while also anticipating this public forum where his wife would be teaching concepts that directly addressed his development areas. The situation was undoubtedly awkward and uncomfortable for him, but it was also potentially valuable if he could approach it with genuine openness rather than defensive resistance. The holiday season arrived with its usual mixture of family obligations and social events. We spent Christmas with my parents in Vancouver, a trip that highlighted the changes occurring in our relationship. My parents had always liked Marcus and appreciated his professional success and the financial security it provided for their daughter. However, they also noticed the way he had historically dominated conversations and dismissed my career achievements, and they responded with visible pleasure to evidence that this dynamic might be shifting. During our Christmas visit, my mother asked detailed questions about the foundation partnership and what it would mean for my career. Marcus listened as I explained the scope of the initiative and the recognition it represented for my work's significance and impact. My father, who had followed my career closely and kept copies of all my books in his study, asked thoughtful questions about how I would manage the expanded workload and whether I would need to hire additional support. What struck me most during these conversations was how naturally my parents engaged with my professional life, and how their questions reflected genuine understanding of what I did and why it mattered. They had always treated my career as legitimate and important, celebrating my achievements and supporting me through challenges. The contrast with Marcus's historical approach was stark, and I could see him noticing this contrast and perhaps recognizing what respectful engagement with a spouse's career actually looked like. We returned to Portland after Christmas, and Marcus resumed his coaching sessions with Dr. Morrison in early January. He reported that they were now focusing specifically on preparation for the leadership retreat and how he could approach my presentation as a learning opportunity rather than a personal threat. Dr. Morrison had apparently given him pre-reading materials related to my presentation topic and had asked him to reflect on how the concepts applied to his own leadership development and to specific situations in his career where he might have failed to recognize or value diverse forms of contribution. Dr. Morrison said that your presentation will probably be uncomfortable for me because it addresses areas where I have significant growth opportunities, Marcus told me one evening. She said that discomfort is often a sign that learning is happening, and that I should lean into that discomfort rather than resisting it or getting defensive. She wants me to take detailed notes during your presentation, and to identify at least 5 specific insights I can apply to my own leadership practice. The assignment was clever, transforming what could have been an awkward situation into a structured learning experience with clear accountability. Dr. Morrison was ensuring that Marcus could not simply sit through my presentation in passive resistance, but would need to actively engage with the content and extract applicable lessons. The approach reflected sophisticated understanding of how to work with resistant learners and how to create conditions for genuine development rather than superficial compliance. As the retreat date approached, I finalized my presentation materials and prepared myself for what would be both a significant professional opportunity and a potentially pivotal moment in my marriage. I would be standing in front of Marcus's colleagues and leadership, sharing expertise that Marcus had dismissed for years, teaching concepts that directly addressed the limitations that had delayed his promotion. The situation contained elements of vindication, justice, anxiety, and possibility all mixed together in complicated ways. The week before the retreat, Catherine invited me to lunch to discuss final preparations and to share her excitement about what my presentation might catalyze within Clearwater's leadership culture. We met at the same restaurant where we had first discussed the foundation partnership, and Catherine was effusive in her enthusiasm about how my work was resonating within the firm even before I had delivered the presentation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.